Good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of Milim to this evening's presentation. Welcome wherever you are in the UK and indeed wherever you are in the world. Our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guest Ian Vellins, and I'll introduce Ian in just a moment. Please do ask questions. Do this by typing whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. As ever, we'll do our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. Let me also draw your attention to the chat facility on your screen. This will allow you to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. Finally, this event is being recorded and you will find it in the next couple of days on our website at milim.org.uk. There you'll find recordings of other past events and also details of our future programme for which you can book tickets. And so to our speaker. Ian Vellins is a retired lawyer, immigration judge and tax judge. He was educated at Roundhay School in Leeds and then at Oxford University, graduating with a first-class degree in law. He subsequently practiced as a solicitor in Bradford and then in Leeds. He was appointed a part-time immigration judge and a VAT and taxes judge, roles that he held for some 20 years. On retirement, he studied for an MA degree at Manchester University in Holocaust Studies under Jean-Marc Dreyfus, and then for a further MA degree at Leeds University in Modern History, where his dissertation on the Kindertransport gained a distinction. He has lectured to many organisations on Holocaust-related themes, on Jewish literature, and on looted art. He is also author of parts of the book Leeds and its Jewish Community. It's a pleasure to welcome Ian back to Milim, I think for the third time. We're eager to hear your presentation, Ian, so without further ado, over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Can you hear me?
We can.
Good. For those amateur psychologists among us, this presentation may open a curtain as to what can happen to a family if they try and hide their Jewishness. In an age where we're encouraged by programs like Who Do You Think You Are?, genealogy research, children preparing family trees for school projects, can one envisage someone who is educated not knowing he's Jewish until he reaches the age of 55. This talk explores the extraordinary background of Britain's greatest playwright, Tom Stoppard. Story, can we start the slides, please? Slide 1, please. This story could also be labelled How His Mother's Trauma Stifled Stoppard's Inner Jew, or a hidden history told before the curtain falls. Only now at the age of 84 is the playwright exploring his most compelling story, his own. Why did he leave it so late? In the play Leopoldstadt, next slide please, he addresses his Jewish heritage for the first time. He finally opens up about a family story hidden from the world and from himself for many years. This is a moving story about fierce maternal love, becoming English, and all the ways we can and can't escape our own identities. His life story asks the question, what makes someone a Jew? Family, life, history, faith? And what happens if all these elements have been removed from your life? Is there anything that remains, some core quality that could somehow be identified as being intrinsically Jewish? With the play Leopoldstadt, can we come off the slides now, please, Alan? With the play Leopoldstadt, with Alan Yentob's arena interview with Stoppard, with Hermione Lee's recent biography of him, over 960 pages, and with an interview I researched in America that he gave to a US academic not available in the United Kingdom, we're nearer to explaining why it has taken so long, nearly a lifetime, for him to explain fictionally his Jewish roots. It's mainly down to the unaddressed trauma of his mother, who, after having nearly all of her numerous siblings murdered by the Nazis, continued to live in fear of what being Jewish could mean. That silence about her past passed on to her son, as well as the means of dealing with emotional pain. So, as he stated, the gates came down. It was only after her death that he could start exploring the background and the revelation of his Jewishness. So, what is his true story? Tom Stoppard was born Thomas Straussler in July 1937 in Zlin, which was then in Czechoslovakia. His Jewish mother, Marta Beck, or Beckova, was born in 1911 into a traditional Jewish family. So his mother's Jewish. She married a Jewish Czech doctor, Eugen Straussler, who worked as a medical doctor for the large Bata shoe factory, the largest shoe factory in Europe and in the world, which was Jewish friendly. Now, Bata at the time was the largest shoe factory in the world. Think of stylo shoes times 50. Think of Montague Burton's tailoring factory in Leeds, 10,000 employees with doctors on the premises, with dentists, with chiropodists, and this is Bata in much more detail. So Marta marries Eugen, two Jews. He's working as a medical doctor in Bata, and they have two children, Peter, and 2 years later, Thomas. This is Tom Stoppard. Germany annexed Austria in March 1938, and in September, the disputed Czech territory of Sudetenland was ceded to Hitler. On the 14th of March 1939, Dr. Albert, the chief of the Bata factory, received a phone call from the Bata directorship that the German army had crossed the border, the frontier border to the rest of Czechoslovakia. Dr. Albert called the 15 Jewish doctors to his house and told them they had to get out right now. Bata had factories and offices in many countries, and the Jewish doctors and their families were assigned to places where they'd be out of danger. The Straussers to Singapore, where he worked for the Bata family. There as a medical officer, and his mother to the Bata office. And Tom and his brother had a Malayan ayah in the rented bungalow who took them around in a double push chair and spoke to them in English, not Czech. Alan, can we have the next 4 slides, one after another, please? And I'll explain. This is the mother's family, the Becks, or Beckovas, as the girls were called. This is before Mother Marta was born, and you'll see these are her siblings, mostly girls, with one boy in the middle. Next. The next slides would be the family. The top left is Marta, a modern woman with plucked eyebrows, a nice coat. To the right is the father, Eugen Straussler, Dr. Straussler. And below, to the left, is Peter, the taller one, aged 4, and Tomasz, aged 2, identical little shorts. And to the right is a domestic photo of Marta and Eugen sitting down in their family home in Zlin in Czechoslovakia. Next slide, please. We then come on to the boat in which they sailed from Europe to Singapore. And they're the 2 boys, Peter and Tomasz, or Tomik as he was known. Tomik's the little one in the front, on board the ship Victoria, sailing from Europe to Singapore. And the next slide. Top photo is the two boys looking very much alike, but there's 2 years difference. Bottom left is taken in Malaysia, the Bata women who had managed to get out, having a group together. And on the right, the two boys later growing up, growing fairly similarly sized as young gentlemen. Okay, end of those slides, and back to me, Alan, please. By January 1940, all women and children were evacuated by boat, leaving their husbands behind in Singapore. The boat set off for Australia, then turned back and went to India, where Marta worked for Bata in the Darjeeling store. So the boys had 4 years there in an Indian environment, speaking English. In the meantime, Thomas's father, Eugen, was evacuated from Singapore with the other husbands by boat, fleeing the Japanese invasion. The boat was bombed and sunk by the Japanese, and his father was missing, presumably dead. Marta did not tell the boys, believing that they had enough to cope with, and they were only told later by their mother's friend. Tom later wrote after his mother's death, "I took it well. I felt almost nothing. I felt the significance of the occasion, but not the loss." In India, Martha met and married a Christian British officer, Major Kenneth Stoppard. He was a bigoted Englishman who had a large-nurtured sense of superiority over what Kipling called the lesser breeds, which included blacks, Irish, Yanks, Jews, foreigners in general, and the urban working class. Yet he married Martha and brought her and her 2 children to England after 4 years in India. He insisted that Tom and his brother drop the name of Straussler for Stoppard. Tom wrote that at the age of 9, he had innocently referred to his real father and was reproached by Major Stoppard with the words, "Don't you realize that I made you British?" Tom was sent to boarding schools, first to Nottingham Prep School as Stoppard Minor or Stoppard II, and then to Pocklington Public School as Tom Stoppard. Tommy at home, told not to mention ever Jewishness, went to church parades, he excelled in cricket and became a thoroughly English schoolboy. His stepfather taught him to fish. He had no Jewish friends in Retford where the family lived. Tom later wrote, "I was still Tommy Straussler, but English was my only language when Ken gave me his name. Englishness had won and Czechoslovakia had lost." Alan, next slides, please. He knew his mother was Czech with a strong foreign accent. Marta had become Bobby and told him little of his family history, and Tom rarely asked. Instead, he got on with the business of becoming an Englishman, and in due course, a remarkable playwright. "She never talked about home," Tom said. "She didn't want me to have Jewish relatives in case Hitler won. She wanted me to be an English boy. I turned out to be good at cricket." Next slide, please. The shield that Martha drew around her son not only protected him, it also set him free to write his own plays. He fell in love with his adopted country, developing a lifetime adoration of English landscape, architecture, and language. "I put on Englishness like a coat," he once said. Next slide, please. He didn't want to go to university. He wanted to be a playwright or journalist. And there he is as a debonair young man, usually with a cigarette in his mouth. And usual photographs show him as a English student, tousled haired. Next slide, please. This is him in later life. Next slide. And there is he with his second wife, Miriam Stoppard. Now his plays, can we come back to me, please, off the slides? His plays before Leopoldstadt were about other things other than Jewishness. Clever verbal wit, like his first play, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, which one critic described recently as having Talmudic pilpul, but that's in the light now of knowing how he was Jewish. He plays like about quantum physics, Hapgood, academic philosophy, play Jumpers, life under communism, rock and roll, time, play Arcadia, memory, the play Travesties, consciousness, the play Hard Problem, homosexuality, the play Invention of Love, Russian history, the play Road to Utopia, and even the screenplay Shakespeare in Love. Anything but Jewishness, keeping his own shutters firmly closed. Although he was married 3 times, the first wife was Julie, the second wife was a Jewess, Miriam Stoppard, and he had various mistresses, including Felicity Kendall, who had converted to Judaism. Judaism never cropped up in his private life. His last wife is Sabrina Guinness, the heiress to the Guinness brewery millionaires. Can we have the next 3 slides, please? So these should be slides of his family. There we are. On the left of this photograph is Patrick Marber, the director of Leopoldstadt. There's Tom Stoppard in the middle, and there's Felicity Kendall on my right-hand side. Next. The next one is his wedding to Sabrina Guinness. And next. We'll come off that, please, Alan. I'll show this one later. So back to me. In August 1968, when the armies of the Warsaw Pact put down the movement for reform in Czechoslovakia, his then wife, Marina Stoppard, was infuriated that Tom didn't get worked up about it as a Czech. She was Jewish, incidentally. He wrote, "I had no special feeling. I knew I was or used to be a Czech, but I didn't feel Czech. I felt about as English as you can get. Even when in 1977 I made my first return to Czechoslovakia, I felt no identification at all. It looked interestingly foreign. My purpose was to write about human rights." Also in 1977, he'd been to Moscow and Leningrad on other human rights stories about Jews who applied for exit visas to Israel, even organizing in 1986 a protest event in London. But when he received letters thanking him as a Jew, he wrote that he felt that he was receiving credit under false pretenses. He replied that he was not Jewish, or at any rate, not really Jewish. "I had an idea that there was some Jewish blood in me, my father's, but not enough to connect me with the Jews who died in the Nazi camps and those who didn't." In 1993, when Tom was 55, his mother and Tom had a letter from Germany from Sarka, the granddaughter of his mother's sister, Wilma, who wanted to come to England to visit them. His mother panicked, as Ken would not have been receptive to that sort of thing. So mother and Tom met Sarka in a restaurant in London at the National Theatre. Sarka got into a tete-a-tete at one end of a long table after the meal. She wrote down the family tree of his mother's generation on a sheet of foolscap, a scene repeated by Stoppard in his play, Leopoldstadt. This was the first time in my memory that my Czech family had been given names and relationships. Can we have that last family group slide, please? Slide 15, Alan. "Sarka, are we Jewish?" he asked. "What do you mean?" "I mean, how Jewish were we?" "You were Jewish." "Yes, I know we were Jewish, my father's family." "You were completely Jewish." I looked at my family tree. "What happened to Wilma?" "She died in Auschwitz." "Berta?" "Auschwitz." "Annie?" "She died in a different camp, don't know where." "Otti," the little boy in the photograph, he survived. "Irma was dying in Argentina, nearly 90, a widow and childless." "Marta, my mother, was sitting at the end of the table." My grandparents all died at the hands of the Germans. My father's parents, Julius and Hildegard Straussler, were part of a transport of Moravian Jews taken to Terezin in Bohemia in northern Czechoslovakia, where they arrived on December the 2nd, 1941. On 9th of January 1942, they were among 112 prisoners transported to the east, to Riga in Latvia. Rudolf and Regina Beck, my mother's parents, were also transported to Terezin and died there in July and April 1944, while we were in India, Peter and me. I was at school. My mother was in charge of the Bata shoe shop in Darjeeling. Tom continues. In 1994, the communists fell and the blind went up. I was in Czechoslovakia for a PEN conference. Very late at night at 2 a.m., I found a young man waiting for me in the lobby of the hotel. He'd read in the newspaper that I was coming to Prague. He couldn't speak much English, but he had an old photograph album with a photo of me and Peter. Alexander, I discovered, was the grandson of my mother's sister, Berta, on that photograph. There were photos of the Beck children in 1914, and a later one of Marta at the age of 16, a flapper in beads, and in 1930, looking glamorous. Can we come off that slide, please, Alan? Tom later visited the Pinkas synagogue in Prague with Sarka and found the names of the Strauslers and Becks on the wall. He met Sarka's father, Janoslav, who remembered Tom as a young child and took him by train to Zlin. In the book of Jewish monuments in Moravia and Silesia, Zlin only has 3 lines. It had been before the war a huge town dominated by the Bata factory, with numerous Jews in the town, all working for Bata. Zlin only has 3 lines in the Jewish book, monuments book, that there was a small Jewish section in the cemetery, and it was the birthplace of the English playwright Tom Stoppard, in inverted commas, in proper name Thomas Straussler, born 1937, end of inverted commas. Tom continues, in 2017, Peter and I went to Zlin to meet a man, Emil Machel, who had been studying the archives of the Bata shoe factory. This was 59 years after we got out. Neither Peter nor I had any memory of being there. We found our family house, a brick cube with its own gardens. This was over a year after his mother's death. By then, Tom had access to a written memoir that his mother had written at his request. He says, when my mother was in her 60s, I asked her to write down as much as she could remember about her life. I sent her a leather-bound notebook as an incentive. She sent it back years later, unmarked. It seemed a waste, and instead filled a few pages in a cheap exercise book in 1981 at the age of 80. The little memoir does not raise the blind very far. As to the names or numbers of her sister or what happened to them, the memoir is uninformative. She writes about family life before and after her marriage and about my father. She describes her parents and my father's parents, but does not say how, when, or where they died. The word Jew or Jewish does not occur. In the move to England, she wrote, I perhaps subconsciously decided the only thing to make it possible to live and truly settle down, I mean the 3 of us, was to draw a blind over my past life and start, so to speak, from scratch. So, were we Jewish? My father would give a little frown. My mother would give a little frown and go, Psst. She had no sense of racial identity and no religious beliefs. Of course, there were Jews in Zlin, but they were proper Jews who wore black hats and went to the synagogue and the rest of it. Jews who were Jews. In Czechoslovakia, there were so many mixed marriages, the matter lost importance. Being Jewish didn't figure in her life until he disputed it. Hitler made her Jewish in 1939, says Tom. England offered her sanctuary. Thankfully, her boys were now safe. In April 2016, he visited the 96-year-old widow of Dr. Albert from Zlin in a flat in Prague with her 2 daughters, Senta and Zari. They tell Tom what happened in March 1939. The two girls remembered my father, the nice Dr. Straussler. When Zari was very young, she put her hand through a glass pane and cut it. Dr. Straussler stitched the cut. Zaria holds out her hand, which still shows the mark. I touch it. I am surprised by my grief, a small catching up of all the grief I own. I have nothing that came from my father, nothing he owned or touched, but here is the trace, a small scar. Tom used this image in the play. Leopold started attributing to Leo, Tom's alter ego in the play. When my stepfather Ken said to me, "Don't you realize I made you British?" In the end, I disappointed him. And yet, did he but know it? It's all too late, this going back. These photographs, that small scar on Zaria's hand, they have the power to move, but not to reclaim. When coming to England, I was still Tommy Straussler, but English was my only language when Ken gave me his name 3 weeks later. And long before Ken asked for it back, Englishness had won and Czech had lost. Tom had written about Jewish dissidents in Russia. Ken asked him after his mother died not to use the name Stoppard anymore. He'd been concerned about my tribalism, Soviet Jewry, but by then it was too late to change the name. I wrote back to Ken that it was not practical. Tom, in his study in England, is looking at the photo of the family back in 1908. They stare back across 90 years of war and peace, the family group who've never made it together through the Holocaust. Here and now in this room, in the only country that is my country, and among books in the only language I can remember speaking, the English writer who is myself considers the Czech family, Beck, Rudolf and Regina, my maternal grandparents, my future aunts, Wilma, Berta, Annie and Irma, and their little brother, Otto, in his sailor top. On the table is another photo a few years later. The new sister is my mother, Marta, in 1914, age 3. He never discussed his upbringing with his mother because she wanted them all to fit in. She worried that there might be a pogrom in Derby. At 84, and with his new play, her son showed that it was never too late to address your heritage. He said, "Unlike my attitude towards the Czech of things, which always had the neutrality of disinterest, I'm definitely uneasy with Jewish orthodoxy. And before I was Jewish, my attitude towards Israel teetered between admiration and a disquieting sense that the Palestinians were paying for the Allies' conscience about what the Germans did, picking up the bill for the Nazis. And now that I'm Jewish, I have the same disquiet. I've never been to Israel. I don't want to be claimed as if I've turned into someone else." He once was asked whether he'd ever experienced anti-Semitism, and he said, "No, because I was English. Everybody knew I was English. Nobody knew I was Jewish." So as to the play itself, in what he says will probably be his last work, the master playwright finds urgent lessons for the present. In the past of a fictional, prosperous Viennese family, loosely based on his own Czech family. Can we have some more slides, please? These are some of the scenes from the play that I've downloaded. There should be eight scenes. This is the scene at the beginning of the play, the very large fictional family, Viennese family. Although Stoppard came from Czechoslovakia, the assimilated Jews in Prague, for example, were very similar to the Viennese assimilated Jews. It had all been part of the Habsburg Empire. So the start of the play itself is way back at the turn of the century. Next slide. This was a scene in the play at Christmas time, where at Christmas time, a young boy in the family innocently puts a Magen David on top of the Christmas tree. Next. And this is the family Seder conducted as part of the play, with grandmother conducting the Seder, one of the grandchildren reciting the prayers in Hebrew on stage. Next. Family, two families, the Mertz family and the Jacobowitz family meeting together, the two families that had come together for the Christmas celebrations and for the Seder night of Pesach. Next. And then this is a scene taken after Pesach and after a bris on the stage, off the stage, where people come to the bris. I don't know why the two people in the front are dancing. I didn't know when I saw the play or when I saw the film on the National Theatre Live. And maybe somebody in the chat button can tell me why on earth the director had got a couple of the characters dancing across the stage, maybe to show a change of scene, but I know not. Next. This is the wife of Mertz with her child reading to him. She's a beautiful woman. She was Christian Catholic, and the husband converts to Christianity, thinking it will help him in his social position. Next. This is Mertz with his wife in better times. Next scene should be in later times, in a later scene where everything is falling apart, where his business is organized, and there he is with his wife. Everything's gone, the furniture is going, the stage is getting barer and barer. And then in the final scene, next slide, please. The final scene of the play is very, very heartbreaking, where everything's gone and there's a meeting between three of the characters, which I'll tell you about. So can we come off those slides, please? And I'll come back to myself, please. So as the play itself, Stoppard stated he's seen the play over 10 times and had cried at the final scene, as did many of the audience. With a cast of 40, and where set and lighting artfully evolves, almost like a Chekhov play, the grandeur of the opening scene turns into gloom as the decades pass. There's a sepia haze, images of the clan in poses projected onto the back screen, sounds of smashing of glass, the stamping of boots. Stoppard appreciates in the character of Leo, a survivor from England, that he, Tom, and the survivor had led a charmed life, and that it was only the roll of the dice that had saved him from the fate of his mother's and father's family. When the play begins, the Viennese family is assembled at the comfortably upholstered apartment, occupied by the matriarchal grandmother, Emilia Mertz, and her son Hermann, who runs the family textile business. Christmas Day, 1899. Yet that holiday is being celebrated in this Jewish household, a mingling of traditions that finds droll expression when a child mistakenly tops the towering Christmas tree with a Star of David. For Hermann, whose wife Gretel, Catholic, cultural assimilation is a fait accompli as Austria moves into a new century. He's married a Catholic and converted to Catholicism. The assembled group represents a cosmopolitan melting pot in which the conversation touches on the latest play by Schnitzler, the painting of Klimt, for whom Gretel is posing, higher mathematics, and the theories of Freud. Although Hermann welcomes his Jewish siblings, the Jacobowitz family, Hermann looks down on their Yiddish accents, their use of Yiddish expressions, and their dress as though they're still in Galicia. But as Hermann speaks of his hopes for the future, social and professional advancement, you sense insecurity pricking at his complacency. And that disquiet assumes dramatic form before the final act ends, when a romantic triangle forces anti-Semitic sentiment into the open. Hermann is refused entry to the jockey club, and an officer refuses to duel with a Jew whose wife he's having sex with, because the officer class prohibits dueling with a Jew as below their dignity. In the second act, with scenes set during the Depression that followed World War I, and in 1938, on the eve of Austria's incorporation into the Third Reich, that sentiment festers into full-blown terrible form. Thus, we watch the once resplendent Metz household becoming increasingly shabby and bare. We introduced a new generation of Metzes whose political allegiances and cultural tastes vary widely. But being Jewish is no longer a choice for them, not in the age of National Socialism. The family freezes at the sound of the pounding on the door by a Nazi demanding their possessions and the portrait of Gretel, and orders them to pack one suitcase each and be outside by 10 a.m. Before then, there's an earlier scene depicting the Pesach Seder still being observed as a family gathering, as a homage to the Jewish grandmother, and another earlier scene where visitors come to the apartment for a bris and are not sure if they're coming for a circumcision or a baptism. By the third act, Herman has lost his business, which has been Aryanized. One relative has been sent to Dachau, and some are learning to become domestic servants as they learn that England is accepting butlers, housekeepers, and domestic servants. In the final scene, it is 1955, and a man who had met early in the play as a boy playing cat's cradle returns from England to the now abandoned apartment to meet a survivor whose family had managed to escape to America. The now grown-up boy from England is a successful writer of comic literature. He's a surrogate for Stoppard. He brings news of the fate of the family in the Holocaust. So many of those depicted in the earlier scenes had been sent to their deaths, despite protesting that they'd been assimilated or converted to Christianity. Leo slowly reveals the names and fate of the murdered families, mirroring what Tom had got to know from his cousin Sarka. We have a family tree written on a paper, projected on the back screen, and visions of people frozen as in a photograph, beckoning from a distant time before they dissolve it into an anonymous darkness. The play demands with gravity and eloquence that we never let those visions disappear. Leo, the Stoppard boy, is reminded that the scar on his hand from a broken glass that was stitched in Act 1 had been stitched by his relative. He'd forgotten, mirroring what Stoppard had been told by the Czech when visiting Czechoslovakia. Do you remember? Don't you remember? Can't you remember? Why can't you remember? The words addressed to the young English visitor in the final scene, who appears to have forgotten most of his early childhood, questions that seem to be posed to the man who wrote the play. It feels like an act of personal reckoning for its creator and a final passionate declaration of what it means to be a Jew. Stoppard has said he's not likely to write at the age of 84 any further play. It's going to be his last play and his last epitaph. He's become Jewish again. Thank you. That's my presentation. And if any of you have any questions, please, in the chat box, then I'll try and answer any questions.
Well, thank you, Ian, for that fascinating presentation. We have a comment from Stephen Massell, who's in London, about the dancing. He says the dancing is imported from the USA, with one of the family making a post-war visit showing off the new steps.
Thank you.
So maybe that answers the question. And Stephen also has a question. He says, look, you know, Stoppard says he recognizes his Judaism at this point, you know, in the 1990s, but surely married to a Jewish woman in the 1970s, Jewish wife, Jewish in-laws, children with Jewish grandparents, wondering that they probably enjoyed Seders and Hanukkah and Christmas in tandem, and wonders why that wasn't inspiration for a Jewish play or Jewish themed play at that time in his life.
Thank you. Very good question, but the answer to that is that Tom Stoppard and Miriam Stoppard, although she was Jewish, were intensely assimilated. They didn't have seders. They didn't observe anything. The children were not brought up in any way as Jewish, and it never occurred to Tom or to his wife, until probably he divorced her and went off with Felicity Kendall and then married again to Sabrina Guinness. It never occurred to him that in any way he should bring up the children as Jewish. One of his children is Ed Stoppard, who appeared in the play, and until he saw the script of the play, and until his father explained to him the background, he had no idea growing up that in any way he had any Jewish roots.
That's interesting. You might have just noticed the comment from John Bowers in the chat, who says, "I know relatives of Stoppard who think it's doubtful that he didn't know he was Jewish." Do you think it might have been diplomatic of him not to appear Jewish?
No, I think it was part of the trauma. I said right at the beginning about amateur psychologists among you. His mother was so affected by the trauma of the Holocaust that she determined to just erase all the history of the Jewishness of the family, bringing the children up as non-Jews under Major Stoppard, going to church as he did in his first school and in his public school, playing cricket, and certainly Ken Stoppard, Major Stoppard, just did not want any Jewishness in their lives. And so when you've got this trauma and this obsession by the mother, that way after the war, she kept feeling that Hitler was going to come to England, and the only way that they're going to survive was to completely hide any Jewish past. It's difficult for us to realize, but there's been numerous books written about the trauma of the Holocaust and the effect of the trauma upon survivors, not only just the survivors themselves, but the second generation.
We've a couple of questions about Tom's older brother. Harriet Brostoff wonders what happened to him, and Naomi Stone wonders whether his recollections were different, being a couple of years older.
Peter went to Czechoslovakia with Tom, went to the factory at Zlim, went to the house at Zlim, but very little has been written about Peter. He's very much kept in the background, and in the biography by Hermione Lee, although Peter comes over as the 2 years older than Tom, and the life in Singapore, and then in India, and then in England, being brought up by Major Stoppard, and then being educated at public schools like like Tom did. He appears very rarely in the biography, and we don't hear, or certainly from that, as to what Peter thought. He's whether that's deliberate or whether he was shy or just didn't want to be interviewed about this, I know not. But in all the research I've made, there's very little reference to Peter in later life.
David Port's interested why Stoppard set this play in Vienna and not Prague. Is there any particular reason?
Yes, because he wanted to set it in a place that was well known. Leopoldstadt was the original Jewish area of Vienna where the Jews had settled. The Metz family in this fictional play actually have the apartment which is shown in the play. That is in fact on the Ringstrasse in Vienna. It's very much more a wealthier apartment. But when he researched it, he was able to go to Vienna and into the history, and he knew more about Vienna than he knew about Prague. And he wanted a fictional family, not necessarily to show that it was his own family that was the basis of the play.
You made a comment about Stoppard's view that the Palestinians may be sort of a victim of the Holocaust. I think quite a left-leaning view that maybe people in these kind of theatrical circles might hold. The play itself really is dismissive of Zionism, doesn't really explore Zionism. Do you think Stoppard might struggle with the Zionist element of Judaism?
Well, there are a number of very famous people, Jews, who side with the Palestinians and are very ashamed at what they believe is happening to the Palestinians by the Israeli military and the authorities. The pianist and musician Thomas Adner is one, Tom Stoppard is another. There are a number of very famous people, Jews, who just don't take the Zionist view. It's a left-wing attitude, I think. It's very common among the left, but he never himself had any anti-Semitic acts or expressions addressed to him, mainly because people didn't know that he was Jewish, and there's no reason to believe that he himself felt bad about Jewishness. It's just that that was he was Jewish, but he was anti-Israel.
Josephine Jackson is interested in your choice of dissertation. Why Kindertransport? Josephine says, I've been giving presentations on Kindertransport for over 20 years. Why are you so interested in this? Or why were you so interested?
I was doing modern history at Leeds University. I had to choose my own topic for a dissertation. I'd studied in Manchester Holocaust studies, and I thought that Kindertransport was an interesting topic. And I'd found, for example, that nobody had written about the survivors who were in Yorkshire. So in all the books that were about the Kindertransport, there was a big blank about the Yorkshire experience. So I interviewed some 20 survivors from Yorkshire, incorporated that in the dissertation, and tried to show that there was some degree of originality there. In a dissertation for an MA, you've got to show some originalities. So I used that as the excuse for doing the dissertation on the Kindertransport. And I was really interested. It's an interesting subject, and I'm very interested in the survivors and the new Huddersfield Museum and Holocaust Centre in Huddersfield, showing the stories of the survivors.
So this is your third visit to Milim, I think. So have you got something else in the pipeline? Will you be coming back a fourth time?
I really don't know, Jonathan. You've got to ask me first. But later this month, I'm going to the Isle of Man with Selma, and we're going on a tour of the internment camps in the Isle of Man, where Jews were collared by the British authorities as potential spies, locked up in the Isle of Man behind barbed wire. And I'll be there on a 3-day tour with Holocaust survivors and people who have actually lived there, with the people who painted pictures and wrote music there. It'll be a 3-day tour. And I think that will provide some ammunition for me for giving a future talk if anybody's interested.
I think it will be. And it's a theme that has appeared in many of the books we've featured over the last couple of years, and particularly in the Isle of Man, has cropped up over and over. And in fact, it's well known to people who live on the island that this happened, and that there was this great flourishing of artistry at the time. Even young people who come from the Isle of Man know that this happened, and know that there were very creative people living there. So thank you so much. Thank you for being our guest this evening. It's been a fascinating talk, and certainly evidenced by the questions people have asked. To thank you, we're sending you a copy of Plunder by Menachem Kaiser. He was our speaker last week. And if anybody missed Menachem's amazing talk, it is on our website to watch on catch up. This is his story about Nazi gold and trying to reclaim a family property in Poland. Now, before we go, just a few words about our future program. Howard Jacobson will now be with us on Sunday, the 27th of March. So please note the change of day and date. Milim is delighted to welcome back Howard, and he and I will be discussing his latest book, which is a memoir called Mother's Boy. The following day, on the 28th of March, we partner with the Jewish Historical Society of England Leeds branch to welcome Dr. Chelsea Sambels. She's from the University of Huddersfield and the Holocaust Centre North. This is, of course, the place you were just mentioning, Ian, and Chelsea is speaking about the lesser-known legacies of the Nuremberg trials. And then on the 4th of April, Joshua Rubinstein joins us from Harvard to tell us about his book, The Last Days of Stalin. The following week, we have Pam Fox. She is speaking about the Jewish hotels and guest houses of Bournemouth. Please do visit our website at milim.org.uk. You can sign up to our newsletter and make sure you don't miss a thing. You can book your tickets there as well. All our events are free, but we do appreciate small donations. There is a link coming up in the chat and also on our website if you want to help us out. It remains for me to thank our guest, Ian Vellins, once again. Thank you so much, Ian. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all again at a future event. Until then, stay safe. See you soon.